Hello and welcome. I'm Nathan Leaf, the Artistic Director of the Concert Singers of Kerry. Thank you for joining us as we present Where We Find Ourselves, a newly composed cycle of 5 songs inspired by and based on the photography of Durham native Hugh Mangum. Mangum was born in 1877 and worked throughout North Carolina, largely as an itinerant portrait photographer. Despite the times in which he lived, he maintained an open-door policy in his studio, welcoming people regardless of their socioeconomic status or race. His rediscovered glass plate negatives, found set aside and disregarded in an old barn decades after his death, provide a valuable lens through which to view history. Mangum's images were compiled into the Where We Find Ourselves exhibit at the National Museum at Duke University, and also into this book. Inspired by the exhibit, composer Michael Busewitz-Korm composed this work specifically to be done during this last year, with all the challenges of the pandemic, and the Concert Singers of Kerry is one of the co-commissioners. Beyond the music, the project included extensive panel discussions with Michael, the author of the lyrics Chantal Sellers, the curators of the exhibit, and other historians. A few selected portions of those discussions have been included in our presentation, and Mangum's images will accompany the music. We are deeply grateful that we have been allowed to share these additional resources with you. The music was recorded virtual choir style, that is, rehearsed completely online and then recorded by each individual musician on their own at home, using phones or whatever other recording equipment they may have. And then we put it together with audio editing software. So it makes it extra special for all of us in concert singers to finally hear it as it was intended to be heard. And now, Concert Singers of Kerry is pleased to share with you Where We Find Ourselves.
The negatives themselves were, of course, exposed and processed by Hugh Mangum sometime between 1897 and 1922. And then he died unexpectedly as a result of the flu epidemic in 1922. At which point he had stored them in a barn on his family farm where his brother and sister lived at the time, and they lived out their lives until the late 1960s when his brother died. So disregard, these negatives were simply left where they were, and they were buried under actually dirt, dust, and the barn was repurposed as a hen house. So you can imagine all kinds of stuff that these negatives were buried under. When I saw these damaged plates that had been picked out of the 1,000 some odd plates that survived into the 1980s when they were donated to Duke, I thought about this whole notion of trauma and how these were not to be put aside, and certainly not to be discarded, but in fact they were, when I looked at them, they were made more beautiful by the evidence of the trauma that they had literally, the negatives themselves had survived, because they had survived. That was part of the interesting part. They had been ignored, they had been disregarded, and yet here they were emerging 100 years later. And they had been changed by those 100 years, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And they emerged into a world that had also changed dramatically. So in a certain way, they had lived that history just as we in Americans had lived that history. They had been sort of buried and then exhumed. That was one of the metaphors that came to mind to me, that well, speaking of damage, the end papers to the book were meant to give this idea almost of people peering through the damage. We chose some of the most damaged negatives and blew them up for the end papers of the book, where the faces appeared. Well, you have to really struggle to see them. And it's as though these personalities are asking for us to imagine them, and the weight of the damage. There's actually kind of this heavy black, and it's somewhere between weight and weightlessness, because on one hand, the damage actually suggests the cosmos and the starry night. But I felt like I was looking at people in these damaged negatives that reminded me of my own. And everyone has trauma. Everyone has suffered. Everyone has understood loss in some way or another. I knew the history that had passed over those 100 years, and I felt like these people were looking back at me across time. I think this was the first moment where I felt like it wasn't just me looking at them, that the images were a window to another time, but it was that moment in which I felt like they're looking back at me through that portal of time, which felt very personal. That's kind of as close as I can get to, using words to articulate an emotion. But I was very moved. And at that point, the whole project became extremely personal. Not that I inserted my personal story into it, but I understood that any of us could insert our own story into the story of these pictures. There's a portrait of a young boy, page 7. It's one of my favorite portraits.
I love that picture. He's so dapper and pressed. I kind of had this thought, his mother getting him ready to get his picture taken,
Yes, that collar is very, very ironed and starched. But the cap is so simple. It's there are even boys who wear their caps at this jaunty tilt, and or who come across as sort of cocky or teenagey, and there's something so vulnerable and open in this boy.
Well, I was just going to say that the look that he has, and the look on so many of these faces, they allow us to spend time trying to interpret them. We engage with them because they're not facts, they're feelings that are being expressed, and we relate to them personally with our own feelings, with our own histories, and each of us would have a slightly different interpretation of that look, and that's what makes it interesting.
Right.
Well, even as far back as slavery, they would get Sundays off, and that would be the only time they could really get together and go to church. And so hats became very important, because you had a hat that you wore on Sunday to church, to dress up, to not only show your reverence, because if you look at the Bible, they talk about a woman wearing something on her head, but that is where you got respect. And it goes as far back as slavery. You never addressed anybody by their first name. You said Mr. So-and-so, Mrs. So-and-so, and you said that when you were at church, because that was the only place you got that. Even I remember growing up with that when I went to church with my grandmother. No one ever called anybody by their first name. And if you were a child with the bow in your head, then you got called by your first name. But once you hit a certain point where you were wearing a hat to church, you got called Miss So-and-so and Mr. So-and-so. And you go back to the cap that was on the young man's head, that was also kind of a delineation of, so you're young. And you would get a different kind of hat, as you became a young man, to wear to church.
So hats even became sort of a rite of passage.
Yes.
Wow.
If we look historically at hats, it was a tradition that was actually passed down. So my mother wore hats, my grandmother wore hats, and you had matching outfits and matching shoes. But as the middle class moved up, that was showing a sense of wealth and respect, was your hat, and the hat that you wore on Sunday, or the hat that you wore for Easter and for Christmas and for special holidays. And the thing about the hat in the African American community is that really people thought they were going to pass that on. And then we hit the 60s, and my generation was like, we're not wearing hats. That's pretty much where that got to, is like, we're not wearing hats. But then, and my mother did that too. She decided she wasn't going to wear hats. But as she got older, she started buying hats. Also, historically, there was a way to wear your hat. It couldn't be wider than your shoulders. It had to, you had a matching outfit for your hat, and you couldn't touch a woman's hat. You know, somebody else's hat.
Intimate.
Yeah. And you didn't borrow another woman's hat. And all of that really goes back to past my grandmother, who was born in 1896 or 1897. But she would talk about hats and church, and, you know, when you got your first hat as a youngster, you know, how important that was.
The picture, I just wanted to point out on page 118 of a woman in a remarkable hat in the lower left corner. So you have to ask yourself, is this how she just dressed?
Yes.
Walked down the street, you know, or was she at an event? So something, she's dressed in a really special way. And I have to say, Mangum had to actually tilt his camera up a little bit so that he got her entire hat in the frame, so that the heads of the other people are much higher up in the frame. So he was very aware of that hat needing to be in the picture. That occurs several times, where he will back up, or he will, you know, include more above the person, so that he doesn't cut the hat off. The hat communicates there, the earrings, the expression, the way Mangum, I think, probably asked her to look over to the side so that he could get that side view of that remarkable hat.
It doesn't hurt to remember that on the topic of hats, that just as today hats were aspirational, maybe you couldn't afford a beautiful, you know, mink stole or come into town in a really fine carriage, but you could probably get enough money for a pretty nice hat.
The hat in these pictures, by the way, you know exactly who the woman in charge is by the way she wears her hat there in the center of the picture. The woman who stands, the Black woman who stands, not quite a part of the family, but not separate either. The way she holds herself and that tilt of her hat, the beauty and self-possession that she communicates. The men who don't have the hats on, how we read them as opposed to the men who do. And the boys in their caps, because they're boys, right?
These photographs are taking place at that sort of a turning point. You know, fashion evolves. So some of the ladies have this beautiful Gibson girl hair, right? So they weren't technically wearing wigs most of the time. Sometimes they wore hair pieces, but more often ladies would wear their own extra hair. So what you would do is you'd brush your hair out to get all the oil off your scalp. You want to pull it down to the ends of your hair, which helped to keep it very shiny. Of course, people didn't wash their hair with soap the way that we do now. Their hair was a bit more oily, and over time, it actually is healthier to do that, but which of us will do that? But you would comb your hair, and then you would save all of what my mother called the rats, you know, all the little tangles that you pull out. And they had these little pots. They sort of looked like a little pot that you would put powder in, except they have a lid, and the little lid has a hole in it about so big. And as you're combing your hair, you would drop the little tangles in there and save them. And when it came time to do your hair the next day, you could pull those out. and put them on top, and then you would very carefully comb your hair over them, and that's partly how you would get that beautiful soft volume.
And
On page 77, we were talking about assimilation, and there are two women in here with the most beautiful, like sort of Gibson-esque, is that a word?
oh, that's one of my pages I have marked. This is, to me, this is where Madam C.J. Walker comes in, because the hair, you know, not only did she come up with a pomade that, you know, would help strengthen your hair, but she came up with what we call the hot comb. You know what that is? It's a straightening iron that they would put, it's a comb that's made of metal that can take heat that they would put on the stove, and then they would press your hair with it. The fact that their hair is straight, to me, means there's more money there. There's more wealth. You look at the clothes that they have on, and what do you call the little brooch thing?
The cameo, right?
Yes, the cameo. So if you look at all the other women in the book, and you look at them, how their hair is straighter, meant that they have invested more time and money in that. And Madam C.J. Walker was one of the first, there are people who followed her, but who had beauty shops in 3 or 4 places around the country where they did hair, and specifically did black hair. And so it's going straight into that. I want my hair straight, and I want to be able to assimilate into society. And that truly does represent that to me.
I wanted to mention about John Merrick. John Merrick was he was born in Raleigh in 1859. And so he was born to an enslaved woman, and he started working at a very young age. He eventually came to Durham and opened up eventually 5 barbershops. Oh. John Merrick eventually founded the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company and helped found the Mechanic and Farmers Bank. He was extremely savvy businessman and became very wealthy, very community active. But it started with the barbershops. That was his first business. Legally, white and black people couldn't go to the same barber. So he had 3 for black men and 2 for white men. And Washington Duke, he was Washington Duke's personal barber. And so one of the things that was interesting when I was doing the research is just how the barbershops actually, for men, became this place in particular for black and white men to relate to one another. And
because the barbers were often black.
Because the barbers were often black, and they developed relationships. And Washington Duke, in fact, loaned him the money to start his first businesses.
So, hair was the center of economic advancement in this community for African Americans.
In Durham, yeah, it was.
For me, you have an older woman and a younger woman, and I'm looking at hair still pulled back, but still coiffed in a way that they're being respectful of what's happening in the culture, of wherever these pictures were taken. I was looking at the younger woman and how her hair wasn't as pulled back as we're accustomed to seeing in other photos, but still proud to be standing there. Then there was one on page 46. This is where we start seeing more straight hair. You brought that one picture up that had straight hair, and here's a couple more where there was straight hair. And also we have to talk about when African-American women talk about good hair versus bad hair. Good hair is straight. It's more anglicized. It might be curly and bouncy, but you don't really have to worry about it ever. You can blow dry it and it'll be straight, versus what we call 4B hair, which is coiled really tightly. and is really very fragile. So if you have 4B hair, I don't know if y'all have y'all heard about all of the different hairs? Okay, so when I talk about coily hair, this is what I'm talking about. So 1 is considered straight, 2A, 2B, wavy, 2C, curly, and then you get into coil, which is 3A, 3B, 3C, and then kinky coiled is 4A, 4B, and 4C. African American women and men that have 3A and 3B hair, 2C, that's considered good hair. When you get into 3C to 4C, that's considered not good hair. And it's always been the question of how do I wear my hair? When Angela Davis in the 70s decided she was going to wear an afro, that made parents all over the country very upset because they'd been working on their children to wear straight hair all of their lives. And here comes Angela Davis. And so when you look at these pictures, especially the page on 46 where those women have straight hair, they're trying to fit into the culture.
So my grandparents, I told you, met at a residential school. So the first thing that they did, oh, sorry. They cut their hair because boys were not supposed to have long hair. And my grandmother, I mean, she was a little girl. She had beautiful long hair. So did her sister Lillian. And they cut all of the girls' hair very short, shorter than this, and told them that they had head lice. Many, many years. They didn't, by the way. They didn't have lice, but this was a thing that they told every kid who came into that school, that they either had lice or they were going to get lice, because lice was, to have head lice made you dirty. About probably close to 10 years ago, I took my son in for a haircut. My mom was with me. We're up here visiting, and I didn't know where to go. So she said, "I'll take you to my my beauty shop. They'll cut his hair." And now, being a military family, we didn't, but also a Native family, we didn't make our boys cut their hair, but they just always preferred to wear it short. And we believe that hair is very personal, and your kids can have it however they like. So Austin liked his hair short. So we took him in there, and he had dandruff, and the lady that started to comb out to comb his hair so that she could do the wash first, she said, "Oh, I think he has lice." It wasn't lice. My mother went through the roof. I can't even tell you how infuriating that was for her, and how humiliating the suggestion that her grandchild could have head lice. And I think it was like a throwback to that.
Yeah.
So
there was a history there that the hairdresser didn't know. You never know where somebody is at the particular time and what the story is behind the reaction.
And she didn't mean any harm. She was just a young girl.
Of course.
Probably her first job. But I think one of the important things that we can take away from looking at these images in this book is that blending in and having hair that helps you assimilate is more than just getting ahead in society. It's a protection. It is a protection. It's armor.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So fashion evolves, and you know how, like, if you think about, we all know one lady of a certain age who found a really great hairstyle when she was in her 20s, decided that's how it looked best, and she still wears it that way 30, 40, 50 years later, right? There's a lady like that on page 106. She is a woman of a certain age, and she has a beautiful Civil War era hairstyle. And I love her. She is doing her own thing. Well, I love this lady. I think she's adorable. So all I wanted to say was, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And people then are just like people now. It's a complete mix of people, those who are very fashion forward, like the beautiful laughing girl with her Gibson girl hairstyle, but she's also very young and fashion forward. And this is an older lady who found a style that she liked and stuck with it. She's not unlike a woman my age who's still rocking those Bon Jovi jeans and the giant perm.
Hey, Jack, comb it back, tone it down, rake it up, make it fit, cut it off, better keep it short, hiding who you are. Scorching it, touching it, singe the fringe, smooth it down, don't forget the lie, the everlasting lie. Hot it flat, curl like that, burning to belong. Yearning to be me. Gibson girl, where's your curl? Straight and great, tie the rags, fry the bangs, sweep it high, better grow it long. Hiding who you are, hiding who you are, hiding who you are. breaking through the borders, standing on our shoulders, breaking through the borders, standing on our shoulders, break our children out of the ways, standing on our shoulders, break our children out of the ways. What shall we name you? Our children yet to be.
When you looked at these photographs, was there any particular photograph that stuck out in terms of not what you knew about the time period, but what you saw in the picture? Like, was there any that like an expression or something evident as being a scar?
I think they often are the ones where the physical damage in some ways you can't help but read figuratively, metaphorically.
Picture on page 72 where a young African-American man who's very well dressed, and there's damage at the bottom of the negative. But what's so striking about it is there's a black spot right where his heart would be.
Yes.
And his look is one of perseverance, of someone who's seen a lot in his life. But the meaning of the image is so changed by that one spot, that dark spot where his heart would be. We just found that enormously powerful and metaphoric for the book. There's one on page 95 of two African-American women peering through to one of the most damaged negatives. And what's striking about it is that, unlike some of the other pictures we've been talking about, what you sense is their absolute presence in that moment, and their aliveness, and their
intensity
ability,
of
their
gaze.
intensity. They kind of transcend that damage and really peer back at us, and you sense their strength and their complexity as human beings.
I think what struck me about that at first glance is that their eyes are the parts of the photograph that are least damaged. And I just think that's such a great juxtaposition. The two photographs on those pages, the damage makes it look as though they're in water, and we're
Yes.
We're looking through another dimension at them as well as time. Additionally, I thought the two on the following page on 96 and 97, the juxtaposition of the young woman on 96, that she is obviously young, and it seems like she's, I hate to say flirtatious, but there's something very beguiling about her,
Yeah.
right? And she just sort of looks so youthful and so full of curiosity about what's to come. And then to have the juxtaposition of the aged plates and the damage on the plates that really show the passage of time, where in her life she wasn't that old, And then on 97, how interesting where the black blemishes on her forehead, how unfortunate the placement of that damage was, but it actually adds to the severity of her gaze in the photograph as well.
Margaret's story about wanting to save these negatives that were going to be discarded because they weren't technically up to the rest of the images, or they were too damaged. Think about the way that we also judge photographs in our own time. If there's a blemish on the negative, or if there's something that's really wrong, there are no negatives now, but if there's something technically wrong with it that can't be corrected, or the person's obscured in some way, we as a society tend not to show those pictures. I think that's one of the things that's so powerful about these, is that it's paradoxical that we're showing them, because most people don't look to photographs now for the damage that's there, as well as what shines through the damage.
There were days of war. Cannons broke the bell. We parted of our sorrows, yet we could not hide our eyes. We could not hide our eyes. A sign that I was heard. A sign that I was seen. A sign that I was heard. A sign that I was healed. Hauntingly beautiful, hauntingly beautiful, hauntingly beautiful. Along dark night is thy God, along dark night is thy God, along dark night disregard, along dark night disregard. By the waves of time's passage, by the waves of time's passage. Waves of time's passage. Meet us where we are, not only where we've been. Meet us where we are, not only where we've been. You feel the scars, now feel the scars. Taste the salt of tears and broken skin. When I slip into the waves of time, would you hold me longer in your eyes and know me longer in your eyes and know me, know me, know me, know me, know me, know me. Remember life, remember joy, remember who we are. Let us sing to the mystery of life. Let us sing to the mystery ancient